James Montgomery Flagg was born in 1877 in the Pelham Manor district of New York City. His talent for drawing was such that at the age of only 12, he had this page of comical drawings published in St. Nicholas magazine. When he was 17 in 1894, he enrolled into the Art Students League of New York, but by this time he was already working at least occasionally as a freelance illustrator, with more for St. Nicholas and other magazines, as well as designing posters for fairly well-known clients. He continued his studies in both Paris and London between 1898 and 1900, and on his return he met and married the wealthy socialite Nellie McCormick, who was 11 years his senior. At this time he was attempting to gain a reputation as an artist, and although his wife's social connections helped him to find work as a portrait painter, it was with illustration commissions for books and magazines that he had the greatest success. And as the 20th century began, his illustrations started to be published regularly in the humour magazine Life. All his work for the magazine at this point was monochrome and essentially comedic, and confirmed that despite his youth and relative inexperience, he was not only more adept with pen and ink illustration than most, but was also an accomplished cartoonist with a fondness for large-headed, good-natured mockery of his fellow humans. In 1903 he appeared in colour for the first time with his comic strip creation Nervy Nat, which ran successfully for the next 4 years, and helped considerably to secure his mutually beneficial relationship with the magazine. But this was very much the exception to the general rule, and other than this his illustrations would continue to be monochrome for the next few years at least. In 1904 he published the first of what would become a series of amusing rhymes, in this instance written as limericks, on a range of social topics, which gave him ample opportunity to exploit his undoubted gift for comedic renditions. This first was titled Tomfoolery, and his visually eloquent humorous spot illustrations were yet another apparently effortless, clear indication of just how much credible humanity he could bring to his endearingly satirised characters. This venture into books was in addition to his magazine commitments, which continued to dominate his output, and included this colour cover illustration for Life's rival, the humour magazine Judge. But in 1906 a second book of rhymes was published titled Why They Married. This followed a virtually identical pattern to the previous book, Tomfoolery, and was a collection of wry observations in 4-line rhymes on the nature of married life, each with suitably humorous, immaculately observed stereotypes in abundance. At fairly regular intervals others of a similar kind were published, but for the sake of keeping the visuals as diverse as possible, these are the last of this kind I'll be showing for now. By this point Flagg's relationship with Life magazine had grown rapidly to a level where he was featuring frequently and now in colour on their covers, with amusing pen and wash images usually set against page white for visual emphasis. More often than not he was creating more anatomically representational figures, which were only slightly but tellingly caricatured. And as his reputation grew, he started to appear on the cover of other magazines, with even more representational romantic images created with the same mediums. In 1909 Flagg made great use of his way with pen and ink for the book Bill Truetell, a story of theatrical life by George H. Brennan. And although the line work was identical to his humorous verse books, the characterisation was, as with his more recent Life covers, far more conventionally plausible. It's worth mentioning that his energetic use of pen and ink was firmly in the tradition established a few years earlier by the older Charles Dana Gibson, the creator of the wildly popular Gibson Girl illustrations, and himself a stalwart of Life magazine. Others were also following Gibson's lead and moving rapidly away from the less animated, more formally hatched Victorian technique. But Flagg was no mere copyist, and he pushed even harder at how far this seemingly gestural collection of diagonal brush and pen strokes could go in describing the human form, whether comedic or more serious in intent. As the first decade of the century neared its end, Flagg had not only become as prevalent in life as Gibson himself, but actually featured on many more covers, which continue to exploit his way with light humour, frequently focusing on interplay between two characters and an absence of background detail. All of them continue to employ only the lightest of touches in terms of humorous anatomical exaggeration, and they were both imaginative and benign in their intent. In that regard, they perfectly mirrored the magazine's generally cheerful inconsequence and absence of the political bias prevalent in many of the others being published at the time. Flagg never worked extensively in advertising despite the financial rewards it offered, but at this time he did produce a couple of relatively rare press ads for cream of wheat cereal, styled identically to his life covers. He was also increasingly being commissioned to illustrate the kind of contemporary novels disdainfully referred to as pot boilers. And among these was 1910's A Successful Wife by G. Dorset. And there were quite a few others in subsequent years, none of which could be fairly categorised as his best work, and most often created with outline and printed as halftones. A year later he created his own serialised light-hearted romance story, The Adventures of Kitty Cobb, which was syndicated in several American newspapers. It was very popular and quickly led to the drawings and narrative text captions of our heroine's ups and downs being collected and published again as a book, which also sold well. Obviously, all the more representational work he was so frequently creating by this point had to be informed by the observation of Poe's life models. And although I don't have any factual support for it, I would be very surprised if even his more cartoonish drawings weren't also firmly based on observation, such was their plausibility. In 1912, Flagg appeared on the cover of Judge again, and from time to time he also continued to grace the covers of other magazines. But it was his commitment to life for which he was most admired and consequently valued by his employers. That they tolerated him working for the competition on a regular basis was a clear indication of the high regard in which he was held. Such freedom was not enjoyed by too many others at that time. By this point he could do no wrong, and in 1913 he created another collection of typically well-executed line-only monochromes to illustrate the satirical novel Roast Beef Medium, written by Edna Ferber. This was an early proto-feminist story about a divorced young single mother making her way through a male-dominated business world. And it's hard to imagine who could have been a better choice for this commission than the always empathetic Flagg. In 1914, The Well-Knowns as Seen by Flagg was published, a collection of lightning sketch portraits and caricatures of celebrities of the period, although I suspect I'm not alone in failing to recognise any of them. But the book sold well and further enhanced his already enviable reputation. When American troops were sent to Europe in 1917 to help the Allies defeat the Germans, Flagg immediately became an important visual propagandist in support of the war effort. Most famously, he created this iconic recruitment poster, which had originally been published on the cover of Leslie's magazine, but was immediately co-opted by the government as a poster. It was heavily based on, but considerably more visually engaging than, the British original recruitment poster illustrated by Alfred Leete some years earlier. Given the fact that the USA was only involved in the war between 1917 and 1918, Flagg returned to poster design and illustration with a vengeance and created a remarkable volume of work, which was plastered over the walls of American cities. And quite a few of them also featured images of Uncle Sam, which were posed by Flagg himself. Even when this character didn't appear in the posters, they were uniformly designed to appeal emotionally to America's patriotic heart, and featured both American and European archetypes and symbolic figures which, without needing to actually say so, were a call to solidarity in the pursuit of victory. They were all plausibly representational in their execution and quite formal in their posing and composition, and like so much of his cover illustration, most frequently devoid of background scene setting. Of course, they were the result of drawn observation, in one case actually created from life in public on the steps of the New York Library. and although Flagg generally avoided the vilification of the enemy and the Kaiser, widely employed in the propaganda created by British and French illustrators, he didn't hide his antipathy for Germany with this darkly humorous Judge cover. And he also indulged in a generous helping of gleefully anti-German vitriol in 1918's Liberty Bond Primer, which set satirical cartoon images alongside early learnerish text for starkly contradictory comic effect. Astonishingly, in addition to the considerable volume of propaganda work he created, Flagg somehow managed to keep his other clients happy with a formidable amount of illustrated work, among which was a series of posters gathered under the generic banner Girls You Know for short silent films made by Thomas Edison's company, with leading actresses of the time portraying Flagg female archetypes. This level of fame could only be dreamt of by most of his contemporaries. Even more astonishingly, he actually wrote stories for dozens of silent movies, both during and after the war, including a live-action movie of his creation, Kitty Cobb. His involvement with the film industry led to commissions for portraits of the stars of the day, such as this 1922 example of cowboy actor William S. Hart. By this point, Flagg's work was appearing with increasing frequency in a range of other popular magazines, including Collier's, the Saturday Evening Post, Good Housekeeping and Cosmopolitan. There were some more painterly colour covers for Judge, but the internal page work was almost invariably monochrome, with occasional forays into duotone, and was most frequently used to illuminate either serialised fiction or short stories. But in the middle of all this success, his wife died at the age of only 56 in 1923. Flagg was devastated by the loss but carried on working, and only a year later he married one of his models, Dorothy Wadman, and in 1925 she gave birth to a daughter. But yet more tragedy followed when Dorothy suffered a severe psychiatric breakdown and had to be permanently hospitalised. But despite all this private misery, he had continued to be productive, and he even returned to humorous work for a collection of sport-themed rhymes titled Locker Room Ballads, written by John E. Baxter. As with the earlier similar jocular rhyme books, he created impeccable, energetic and highly plausible comedic figures, with his unrelentingly expressive line work to illuminate and add comedic visual detail to the humour of the rhymes. At this time he also created some more press advertising for Elgin watches, featuring his elegant young female characters. But in general he continued to keep a certain distance from advertising work, and throughout the later 1920s, magazine work for Judge and Life in particular was still very much to the fore of his output. Other than the odd exceptions, such as the Locker Room book and this amusing Benjamin Franklin cover, by this time he rarely expressed himself through cartoon styling, and his colour covers and monochromes for Life and others continue to be barely caricatured at all, even though frequently humorous in intent. This evidently continued to be the case into the 1930s, and among other significant commissions, he illustrated a considerable volume of stories by British author P.G. Wodehouse, published regularly in Cosmopolitan magazine. And it was perhaps somewhat ironic that an American illustrator created arguably the most evocative visualisations of Wodehouse's most British humour, better than any other attempts at the time. This led to his humorous fiction becoming almost as well known and admired in the USA as it was in Britain, and added considerably to Wodehouse's commercial success and international reputation. Demand for Flagg's portraiture of the famous and wealthy was proving to be an increasingly profitable sideline, and in the middle of the 1930s he also produced a series of gestural but evocative and convincing grainy portraits of Hollywood's female leading ladies of the period for the cover of Photoplay magazine. It was in the middle of the 1930s that Life ceased publication, although it was immediately relaunched as a more serious-minded current affairs magazine. But this didn't particularly adversely affect Flagg's career, as by this time he had become every bit as popular with the readers of many other magazines, and he continued to be a ubiquitous presence with his primarily romantic fiction work. I can find no specific purpose for this rousing patriotic oil-painted image of Uncle Sam from 1939, which he created well before the USA's involvement in World War II. But when America joined the Allies following the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, Flagg once more set about giving his support to the war effort with a large volume of propaganda posters. As with the previous conflict, most of these images played up to the patriotic instincts of the citizens, and some were directly targeting young Americans to join the fight. Others were created for fundraising purposes, including this 1944 war bonds poster with an overtly belligerent image of Uncle Sam warning the Japanese what was heading their way. Sometime before the war, Flagg had begun a long-term relationship with another one of his models, Ilse Hoffman, who was half his age. But tragically she committed suicide for unknown reasons in 1945, and Flagg was alone once more. Following the end of the war, the demand for Flagg's illustration fell away rapidly. The rise in the use of colour photography in magazines hammered a significant nail into the coffin of his career, and younger, more modernist illustrators were being offered the work that remained. There was some colour illustration of attractive female characters to accompany the 1949 series in the American weekly magazine titled Cooking Around America. And he also created this painting for the cover of Ringling Brothers Circus brochure a year later. But other than these examples, he confined himself to painting more portraits, until eventually his eyesight began to fail quite dramatically, and he was rendered incapable of working in any capacity. And James Montgomery Flagg died a few weeks before his 83rd birthday in 1960. Despite the unfortunate end to his long career and his physical deterioration, he had enjoyed spectacular success, and in many ways was to a significant degree the progenitor of what I am tempted to call all-American illustration. Virtually every single image he created, whether humorous or more serious intent, was directly connected to the country of his birth, the times in which he lived, and the people he saw around him. As such, his accumulated output isn't just entertaining, but also functions as a documentation of 20th century American life in peace and at war.